All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome. So it's a real honor today to have Vincent Stanley here. And for those of you interested in buying his book, The Responsible Company, we have it subsidized in the back of the room for, I think, a very reasonable price of $5. So be sure and grab one of these before you head out. My name is Jacqueline Fuller, and I run our Google Giving program here at the company, and I'm just going to give some brief introductory remarks about Vincent. So, I think a lot of us joined Google because we thought it's a different kind of company. And it's a company that goes beyond don't be evil to actually trying to proactively use the corporation to do good in the world. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that that's unusual, and that hasn't always been a meme that existed. But we have come to that standing on the shoulders of people like Vincent, who really set into motion the whole idea that corporations can go beyond making money, and corporations can go beyond a few trivial efforts at being socially responsible to actually making that a central part of who you are as a company. So we here at Google are really indebted to the legacy that he's created. So Vincent has been with Patagonia on and off for 40 years, since it was founded. Actually, just this week when I was working out at the gym, I was making a comment about some workout gear, and the woman was standing there wearing a Patagonia jacket, and she said, yeah, it's just like Patagonia, you just feel good. You might spend a little more up front, but you just know it's gonna last forever. So that was literally happened just this week. So I think we're all aware of the great products that they make, and we love their products. Might be less aware of the legacy that they've created in the work that not only they do as a company, but the memes that they've created around the world. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. I got to read the book, and some of the things that were really interesting to me in it is, for one, the attitude of humility that goes throughout the entire book. In fact, he says, didn't start Patagonia with the notion of being a really responsible company, but that was, you all were stunned into consciousness. And Vincent played a major role in creating some of the changes that brought about a responsible company. He also started an interactive website called Footprint Chronicles, which I urge you all to look at. They do things, for example, like being completely transparent about their supply chain, which I think is really innovative and a good prod for the rest of the industry. So we're really honored to have Vincent here today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I usually like to start just by reading the first couple of paragraphs of the book to give an idea of what the tone is and what our the book was written by Yvon Chouinard, our company's founder, and myself, and in some ways it's a sequel to the first. Can you all hear me way in the back? Okay. In some ways, it's a sequel to his first book called Let My People Go Surfing, which was both his autobiography and a laying out of Patagonia's business philosophies as they had evolved over a 30-year period. This book is a little different, and we wrote it not so much for ourselves, but for our friends and allies, and for people who are interested in going into business, and for people who are in business and trying to do something different. So the book starts out, we are all still in the earliest stages of learning how what we do for a living both threatens nature and fails to meet our deepest human needs. The impoverishment of our world and the devaluing of the priceless undermine our physical and economic well-being. Yet the depth and breadth of technological innovation of the past few decades shows that we have not lost our most useful gifts. Humans are ingenious, adaptive, clever. We also have moral capacity, compassion for life, and an appetite for justice. We now need to more fully engage these gifts to make economic life more socially and environmentally responsible and less destructive to nature and the commons that sustain us. This book aims to sketch, in light of our environmental crisis and our economic sea change, the elements of business responsibility for our time, when everyone in business, at every level, has to deal with the unintended consequences of a 200-year-old industrial model that can no longer be sustained ecologically, socially, or financially. The co-authors have been involved with Patagonia since its inception nearly 40 years ago, but it is not the purpose of this book to retell our company's history in detail. This book, though it draws on our experience at Patagonia, aims to be useful to all people who see the need for deep change in business practices and who work in companies quite unlike ours. And although we mostly address companies that make things, or like us, design things made by others, this book is germane to all businesses that offer a service, or to NGOs and nonprofits that want to treat their people well and reduce the environmental impact of their operations. This book is for anyone who works, not just business leaders and managers. It is also for business students and other young people who want to engage their best, deepest self in the working life ahead. And I kind of go on to tell the story that we did not intend to be a responsible company. In fact, we got our start as a climbing equipment company that made hardware. I think we were the leading climbing equipment company in the world, and we had about $200,000 in sales in 1972. Every piece of gear that we made had a burden to it, which is that you did not want to kill your friends or yourself. So the quality control, or the attitude that we brought to our products was quite serious. And the whole idea of Patagonia, what we found at the end of the year of selling our $200,000 worth of gear with about a 2% profit, is that we weren't getting ahead very fast. So we decided to create an irresponsible company. We would get into the rag trade, was our attitude. We would sell clothing to climbers. We would make a killing. And it would be so easy because it didn't involve hardware. It didn't involve any potential for hairline cracks or metal fatigue. And this would be our passport to paradise for the future. So we did. We got into clothing. We started importing rugby shirts, heavy sweaters. Then we got into the idea of layering for the mountains. So we were the first company to produce sort of polyester underwear that wicks moisture outwards, and a layer of insulation, and then a shell over that. A couple of things that sort of, we were not concerned about what the environmental impact of that clothing was, or even not so much concerned about the social conditions of the people that made those goods. But we always had a strong concern about the environment. And I think that that has to do with the people who work there, because most people were a sort of band of climbers and surfers who spent as much free time as they could in the wilderness. The wilderness for a surfer starts at about 10 yards from the beach, and the wilderness for a mountaineer starts about a mile in from the roadhead. And I think what being in the wilderness does for you, it exposes, for all of us who are used to living in kind of well-managed, civilized life, being in the wild reminds you that you're not always not necessarily at the top of the food chain, that you can be at physical risk, that you're in the presence of something that is more powerful than you, and then also more beautiful than anything we can make. And I think that the sense that you get from being in the wild is something that cannot really be explained to someone, but it can be shared. And a lot of the early employees at Patagonia shared this feeling. So it was very easy, as we developed the business, to start, the owners started to give away first 10% of the profits every year to environmental causes, and we focused on grassroots environmental groups that were saving a particular patch of land or stretch of water. We gave to people nobody else would give to. We then changed that because we know that accountants love to play with profit numbers, so we changed the figure to 1% of sales or 10% of profits, whichever is greater. And we've been doing that for 30 years. And we're now we do about $600 million a year this year, so we're giving away $6 million. That was easy for us. And one of the things I argue for in the book is that everything that we learned came very slowly, kind of step by step. And that one small victory enabled us to think in a way that would make the next victory possible, mostly because we could think it possible. So I'd have to go back to even before we made clothes, to a major decision we made when we were still a climbing company to explain kind of the origins of this and how it worked for us. When we were known for our pitons, which for climbers, if you know that, it was the old sort of time-tested way of protection while you were climbing a crack. You'd hammer a piton into the crack, and then you'd run your ropes through it. It would protect the belayer. And each time that you placed that piton, you did it with a hammer, and then to get it out, you'd tap the piton with a hammer and draw it out. And the problem was that as climbing became more popular in the early 70s, there were only certain routes that were wildly popular with climbers. So you had hundreds of people going up the same cracks, and they'd be hammering in the pitons, and then they would be tapping them out. And they were ruining the rock. They were ruining the climbs that were kind of the basis, and the love of climbing that was at the basis of the business. So what we did is we published a catalog in 1972 with an article by Doug Robinson, who's a Bay Area local, called The Whole Natural Art of Protection, which pointed out there was an alternative to pitons that the British had developed. They're these little hexcentric shaped aluminum chocks that could be torqued into a crack without hammering and then torqued back to remove it. And of course, we came out with a line of these in the same catalog. And I think we had something like 80% of our business was reliant on the piton market at the time we did this. So it was a risky move, even for a $200,000 company. There were still 10 of us had families to feed. And the business really changed. I say overnight, but I'm in marketing, so that's an exaggeration. It was about 6 months, 8 months before the transformation was complete. But our customers really did move away from pitons and start using hexcentrics. And it really did make a difference right away on the climbing routes around the country and around the world. What this did is it gave us the experience that we could actually talk to our customers this way, that they would listen and that it would make a difference. And so I'm telling this rather long story so that when we go into the next phase, we're in the clothing business. We're 20 years later. We're quite successful. We're doing about, I think at the time, about $30 million a year. We are giving away some money to environmental groups, but otherwise we're a fairly conventional business. We open up a new store in Boston on Newbury Street. And we discover after about 3 days that employees are getting sick. Stomach aches, headaches, and they have to go home. So we call in and we realize there's a problem with the ventilation, and we call in an environmental engineer, and he fixes the problem and says, you know, here's your bill. And we said, well, thank you, that's fine, but what was causing the problem? And he says, well, formaldehyde. And the formaldehyde was off-gassing from the cotton clothes in our basement. And this was the first that we really understood that our software business, which was supposed to be so much more environmentally benign than our hard iron business, that cotton was actually was a culprit, that the chemicals that went into growing cotton at the time, about 8% of the pesticides in the world went into growing cotton. It's a really intensive, pesticide-intensive crop. And it's less so today, but at that time, those were the numbers. And that of all, we then decided to, we were shocked to find this out, so we decided to commission a study of the 4 major fibers we used, which was polyester, wool, nylon, and cotton. And then we were further shocked to discover that cotton was the worst of the 4 fibers, that even though polyester and nylon were oil-based and had that set of problems, cotton was the worst. There was, unlike with polyester or with nylon, an alternative to conventionally grown cotton, which was to use organic cotton. And so we ran a couple of test programs, and we made T-shirts out of organic cotton, and then we made the decision to go all organic in one season. We had about an 18-month period from the fall of '94 to the spring of '96. We discontinued the use of conventional cotton. We were a little premature. We ended up buying all of the cotton grown in the San Joaquin Valley. We were praying for rain, because if we hadn't had rain, we wouldn't have had shirts. And the interesting thing for us is that in the process of, there are 2 interesting things. One is we never could have made this change if we hadn't done the change in hardware 20 years before, because that gave us the confidence that we could talk to our customers, explain what we were doing, and not lose the business, even though the price of the clothes would go up. Second, the criteria for making the change was really important to us, because this was something we could do something about. And you know, the Google novel or the Google motto is do no evil, I believe. Don't be evil. That we have a very complicated mission statement, but the second part of it is cause no unnecessary harm. And the word unnecessary is key, because it enables you as people in business, when you approach a problem and you know that there is a solution, it gives you permission to pursue that. So we couldn't do anything about making polyester out of non-oil substances, but we could make organic cotton, and we did. And that was the second thing that gave us a lot of confidence in terms of pursuing new activities that other people hadn't touched. We were not a special group of people. We were not very bright. We were not well capitalized. But I think that with this background, it enabled us to do things that other people hadn't done before. So that's kind of, I like to talk about that at businesses because I think it's really true for, there's been a progression since the organic cotton change in 1996. Our most recent kind of big move was about 3 years ago. We got together with Walmart and issued on joint stationery, which is, I think, the only letter that ever went out in history on joint stationery from Patagonia and Walmart, inviting major players in the apparel and footwear business to get together to a conference to form a coalition to evaluate the environmental and social factors involved in clothing and footwear, to create an index for designers so that they could and build it into the company's ERP systems so that the designers would understand when they were making a choice what the environmental and social ramifications were, and then eventually to take this index consumer-facing, which is still in the future. But we want to get to the point where a customer can take the phone and run it over a QR code on a pair of pants and read what the environmental health and the social health of that product is. We invited those companies. About 16 people came to the first meeting, and this was only in 2010. So 3 years later, We now have 82 members of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that represent a third of all of the apparel and footwear made in the world. And the index called the Higg Index has now been developed, and the companies are beginning to implement it into their design. I don't know how many years we are away from having a consumer-facing index, but it's not that far if we were able to develop the meat of it within 3 years. This is huge, because if this is successful, then what happens is if you've got a third of the industry adopting this, the rest of the apparel and footwear industries have to follow. And it has the potential to make a huge difference in reducing the impact, the environmental impact, and the social harm done in those industries. And these are two of the oldest industries in the world. Apparel is made the textile machines are fancier, but it's basically made the way it was 150 years ago in Lowell, Massachusetts. The only thing I'd like to say before I open it up for questions is to tell you why I wrote the book, or why Ewald had his own reasons for approaching the book. But although I've been with Patagonia for 40 years, my primary vocation is as a writer. And I think that one of the things that I had a question, I was coming, after 40 years around this company, my question was, how did the culture survive? In a company, how had it grown from a company with 10 employees to a company with 1,000 or 1,200 employees? How had the culture stayed intact from a company that had that $200,000 in sales to a company that now had 600 million? And for a writer, the way to attack that question is to write about it. And so that was essentially my reason for working on this book, is I wanted to come up with the answer to that question and then also write something that would be useful to others, particularly to young people who are starting out. Ewald's primary contribution, and it was an essential one, which is to say, okay, we're talking about culture, we're talking in general about what we view the responsibilities of business to be, and in some ways these will not be unfamiliar to you, except that we do say that businesses are responsible to nature in a way that other people might not allow. But his primary contribution was the addition, he said, let's make it practical. And so at the end of it, we have about a 45-page checklist, which anybody can use to go down and look at the various aspects of business and say, are we composting the forks in the cafe? Are we using LED bulbs? Are we creating berms for runoff water? So what I'm proud of in the book is this kind of combination of talking about our own experience and then providing some very practical advice at the end. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
I had a question just on manufacturing. So I think I always struggle with clothing that today that it's where it's made. I think it's good that it's not made just in the United States and the servicing global market, because we need to grow. People in other countries are growing.
Yeah.
But then one thing I love about being made in the kind of the G8 nations is they have a lot of great things in place. Like there's OSHA. Mm-hmm. There's just like somebody's formaldehyde in other countries. Well, they can get a new set of workers to come in because they're so poor that they have this attraction. So like my jacket says, I always struggle with when my jacket says it's made in Ecuador with U.S. based parts. Uh-huh. I feel uncomfortable with that. It's not just Patagonia, but it's everywhere. I feel uncomfortable, with that. And can you explain your thoughts on what you're doing, on where you're making things, what kinds of decisions, and where you're going towards? I know like skill becomes a big thing because here in America, even because they moved all the clothing outside. Really, it's really the high end has remained here, but the middle end, they don't have that many people with those kinds of skills. And there's one company's just trying to get it back, but they're not so successful. So
yeah, that's a really good question, and I can give you some The answer is a little complex. When we started, about half of our clothes were made in the US and about half were made abroad, and we actually made quite a bit in Hong Kong, which at that time produced the best sportswear in the world. One of the things that happened, and it was actually accelerated by NAFTA and some of the other free trade agreements in the mid-90s, is that it really killed the American textile industry. And when the mills moved away to Asia, the sewing tended to follow. I've been reading some interesting articles I recommend to you folks if you're interested in this issue. In the Atlantic, there was an article about American manufacturing moving back here, and there was also one in The Economist about 2 months ago. And they were talking mostly about what they call white goods, refrigerators, that kind of thing. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that companies that outsourced their manufacturing to Asia about 12 years ago found that after about 5 years, they no longer knew how to make the refrigerator. They didn't know how to repair it. By moving the intellectual capital so far from manufacturing, they lost touch. The other thing that's happening is that labor becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of the cost of every product made, to the point where one interesting thing I read in the Wall Street Journal, there is more manufacturing done in the United States than at any time in history. But the number of people working in manufacturing is the same as worked in 1941, when we had about 1/3 the population. So the manufacturing that's coming back to the States is not creating jobs. It's being done far more efficiently, and there are great advantages to that, but they're not bringing work back. The second thing, in both articles, they said that the apparel industry is not moving back here. And that's kind of a complicated story. I think smaller companies are doing some interesting work, starting their own factories in urban cities, and the factories are decent. They're not sweatshops like we had in the 70s and 80s in the Bay Area and in LA. High-end clothing is actually not made. In high-end outdoor apparel is, when you're looking at Gore-Tex shells and those kinds of things, they're made in about 5 or 6 factories in the world, and they're not in the United States. The capacity to make that is not here. So my sense is that eventually the industry will gravitate back to where the textiles are made, and the textiles could be made in the United States, but it will probably involve some kind of revolution in cut and sew that involves much less labor. That would be my forecast. And for us, labor is, we're not moving because of labor. We're not moving because of the cost of labor, but we have to move because of the availability of labor and the availability of skilled cut and sew factories. It's a rather long answer, but that's kind of where it is right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming over for the talk. My question is slightly similar. I haven't read your book yet, so you might have some answers in there for my question. So I'm kind of curious. You were mentioning the trend of like the textiles being abroad and like how those industries might be like shifting back over there. I was wondering, with kind of Patagonia being able to build its brand for all these years and be able to start to implement these pretty interesting socially responsible practices along the way and communicating with kind of the consumers you serve in order to do that. I think I'm just curious what advice you might give to folks who are or similar companies or apparel brands in the developing economies that have like different types of pressure or have different relationships with the customers they serve or the markets that they're in, how they can also be socially responsible. Just, any thoughts or advice that you might have on that?
I think it's a good question. It's hard to answer in the abstract. I was on a panel. I was at there's a big trade show in Munich last week for the outdoor industry, with the snow outdoor industry and apparels. And I was on a panel with somebody from O'Neill, the wetsuit company, and also with these 4 startup companies. And they were really great. They were, and two of them were in Britain, and a couple of them were elsewhere in Europe. And the smaller, 2 of the companies were really from Britain. Were trying to source everything with made in Britain materials, and they had a very high standards of quality and craftsmanship. And so I really rooted for them. But the ways in which we could be helpful to them would be or the advice I would offer them would depend on what the company was making and what its core values were and all that. It's very hard to answer. There's one thing I told them that I have any amount of respect for anybody who's starting up a company now, because I think when we started up in the 70s and 80s, it was so much easier. Talked with other old timers, and we both think, or with the founder of the company, and he and I both think that if Patagonia started today and made the mistakes we made in the 70s, we would have been out of business. It's a less forgiving environment.
Hi. When you started your talk, you said that do no unnecessary evil or bad things that aren't necessary. I was wondering if you could walk us through the process your company does to determine if something's necessary or unnecessary. I have this probably false idea that companies don't do anything that they think is necessarily evil, but maybe drives for profit. And since you're a for-profit company, if you're balancing increasing your market share by increasing more shirts produced, but you're going to have to offshore the production of those materials, how do you come to a conclusion to say, yes, it's a little bit evil, but we're okay with that amount of evil? Okay.
We took, forgive me for another long answer, we took out about a year ago, the Black Friday book, the year before last, we took out an ad in the New York Times saying, don't buy this jacket. And the jacket we featured was something called the R4, which is a piece of heavy insulation. It's one of the most environmentally friendly pieces we make. It is, it lasts forever. It will last for decades. It is made of 60% recycled polyester, and it can be, every product, every Patagonia product, when you're done with it, when it's kind of worn out, we will take it back and we will recycle it. And in the case of polyester, we can actually melt it down and extrude it into new fiber that's of equal quality to the old, which is, right in with William McDonnell cradle-to-cradle values. But what we pointed out was that this, the water used to create this, this jacket could provide drinking water to 45 people in a day, that it generated 2/3 of its weight in scrap waste, that it generated 23 times its weight in greenhouse gases. So, where I'm leading is, I think it's not just a question of a little bit of harm versus less harm. It's that everything that's involved in manufacturing creates a great deal of harm. And it raises all kinds of questions about, or raises very serious questions for us about the nature and the future of the consumer economy. I've mentioned, I wear a simple gold wedding band that generates 20 tons of mine waste, the production of each gold band. So when we talk about making products, once you start to kind of pierce the veil and go deeper into the supply chain, the questions get harder and tougher, and you realize that everybody who's making things is culpable in all kinds of ways. So for us, the question is how to certainly not to do the unnecessary harm. Certainly we can make clothes out of organic cotton, and certainly we make decisions to, kind of following the 80-20 rule, or depending on what new developments are in fabrics, to make a product more environmentally friendly. Counter to that is the fact that nobody wants a piece of clothing that is ugly. Nobody wants a piece of clothing that doesn't fit. Nobody wants to wear clothing for outdoor use that actually doesn't perform for its intended uses. So we've actually backed off from time to time on the environmental benefit of some of our new fabrics when it turned out that those fabrics didn't perform as well as the others. So it's a really complicated.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nice jacket.
Thank you. You made some really interesting points regarding the jacket. Like, it takes so many pounds of whatever to generate it, and all these statistics and these numbers. You have to have people who are calculating them. I'm wondering, like, what does that look like on your team? Like, do you have a team of sustainability people? How does Patagonia go about getting those numbers? And just like in general, for people who are interested in that field, what advice would you have?
There's two questions in there.
Yeah.
The first one, we have a very, until now we've had two people internally who handle the environmental issues at Patagonia, and we've added a third. And we purposely keep it small so that we try and make that, divide that work up and make it a part of the DNA of the company in all of the divisions. We have not done a lot of formal life cycle analysis work, which is very expensive. But there are tricks we can do. For instance, we can look at our underwear has the same kind of inputs across 200 different styles, so we can calculate the metrics for that and then apply it to the line. But what we're going to do now is we're going to adopt the Higg methodology, and that has been established. Nike developed a tool that was kind of the ancestor of this, and the outdoor industry developed an eco-index that was the ancestry of this. So we'll use an industry-wide tool, which is going to be very useful for the consumer because all the companies are dealing with the same numbers. And that provides kind of parallel information. And then the second question is, it was an interesting question that came. I was talking to the sustainability manager at the Gap this morning. And for people who are interested in the issue of sustainability, the main thing is what kind of work do you actually love to do? Because we need people who have an interest in sustainability or responsibility in accounting, in manufacturing, in IT, and those things kind of come first. You know, the actual core set of skills comes first, and then sustainability comes second. Kind of the last point, I've been talking to a lot of colleges, and until 5 years ago, there were no sustainability programs in schools. Now they're in every business school and in every design school. And this is going to make a tremendous difference, I think, in 5 to 10 years. But for now, most companies, like Patagonia, in spite of the fact that we were started by climbers and surfers, you can look at the various subcultures in our company. The people who work in textiles came out of Duke or University of North Carolina. The people in accounting, they look different. They came out, they came out of MBA programs. So, and nobody had any sustainability in their training. So the language of each profession does not have that built in yet into its work. And I think it will be in another 5 or 10 years as these people graduate from programs and then get jobs.
I was just curious, when you were talking about how a while ago you went from giving 10% to 1% and how it was very based on grassroots, smaller companies, what is the difference between what you did then and what you do now with the 1%? I mean, I know there are a lot of other companies that do, the 1% for the environment or giving back, but I mean, there's just such a plethora of environmental organizations, grassroots or larger, such a wide scale of ones that actually give back and ones that don't. I mean, how do you even begin to pick different ones, or do you adhere to a lot of similar ones? And what's that process like?
We have a team that awards the grants. We have a grant application process, and then employees elect people to a particular team that considers the grant applications and then makes the decisions each year. We haven't had a fundamental change in how we give the money as it's grown. But I think now we're at the point For a while, we were giving to 300 different organizations, and now we're giving to about 750. And at a certain point, we're going to reach a kind of plateau where we have to kind of question and look at how we give grants and what kinds of organizations. But for now, it's been focused for 30 years on these small grassroots organizations working very specifically to save or restore particular habitat.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious about your thoughts on third-party industry certifications. So you mentioned the industry-led effort with Walmart for sustainability efforts. I had thought that these were a great thing, and then recently learned in one of the factory fires that happened in, I'm not sure if it was in Bangladesh or Pakistan, that they actually had been certified by Social Accountability International, and they had all the proper certifications, which was a bit disappointing since they're one of the ones that actually seemed legitimate and independent. So just wondering if you think this is a good kind of approach to having industry compliance for social and environmental efforts.
Right. Thanks. I think it's absolutely necessary, but we work with the Fair Labor Association to vet the factories, but it's kind of a problem in that you are relying on a report card system, or you have people going in and auditing practices, and it's not really systemic. It's kind of based on a kind of police work. And that's how I think you could get a situation like the horrific fire in Bangladesh. It's also a complication. One of the first question I had about moving things offshore. The larger your supply chain and the more distant it is, the more risk you have of problems like this, or the harder and more expensive they are to deal with it. So one of the things we've done is to really condense from over 115 factories. We now only deal with 45 cut and sew factories. And so that enables even our work with FLA to audit more frequently, or to keep a closer tab on what the practices are. But it's not a foolproof. Third-party auditing is necessary. It's terrific. If you didn't have it, companies would not have the capability to go in and do this on their own. But it's by no means the total answer. The Higg Index, by the way, may help, because that includes social as well as environmental factors. And so, anytime you're making decisions up front, you have much more interesting and stronger results than when you're dealing with a kind of report card situation on the back end.
Thank you again. One of the things I really love about Patagonia is the repair policy. So my jacket had a hole in it. The zipper's broke. I sent it in, and you guys fixed it. How are you influencing? Is there such we've come now so disposable that you're going back to kind of the old way where we fix things? How, are you influencing others, and what is the business? Is there any business around it? Why do you do it? And are you influencing other vendors to follow your footsteps? Because I personally always tell people. I just told my friend today, you like my jacket? It's a Patagonia jacket, and I said, yeah, it's you guys, there was something broken, and I returned it and I fixed it. And so it is more, but I get a lot longer use. I'm not sure if it's cheaper in the long term. I don't know. I haven't.
Well.
But anyways, can you just go to the original question? Is like, why do you do it, and are you influencing other vendors?
Right. Thanks. First, a very quick thing. If you talk about environmental impact of anything that's made, durability is a major issue. If it's good in the first place and it lasts a long time, you're going a long way to pay back the planet for the harm you did in the making of that product. So we like to make things that are long-lasting, and then as part of it, we have a program called Common Threads, in which we look at the 4 basic R's. First, reduce consumption. Second, repair. And third is reuse. We're encouraging customers, if you're not wearing a product, take it out of your closet, give it away, or sell it on eBay. And then the last is we take back anything for recycling. So repair is important is an important function. It's important for us as designers to make things that are repairable, and there have been times we've made some outerwear with zippers that's kind of tough to redo. We've reduced the repair time from the customer to our Reno warehouse to make sure that people pursue that as an option, because we found that people, when we had an 8-week turnaround for repairs, we'd end up giving somebody a jacket rather than making them wait that long if it was a new product that had a problem.
Yeah, I think that's really great, especially like the eBay one. I think that's really innovative. It's like if you look at other vendors, they don't support reselling your good on eBay. They say, well, no, you got to buy it from the store, brand new. Yeah. You can't buy on. They don't support a secondary market, and I thought that was really bold, and I think it is really great for sustainability.
Thanks. We're starting in our stores. We have a secondhand aisle in the Portland store that we started called the Second Home.
So I guess I'll wrap it up with one final question. So you're looking at Patagonia as a company. How do you promote and continue your culture as you expand, and how do you make sure that employees can work on these interesting projects, like you mentioned the Common Threads initiative?
I think I haven't had a chance to talk to a lot of people here, but I know that you have your program that about taking 20% of the time to work on projects that you feel personally interested in. And we don't have a formal program like that at Patagonia, but I think that there's a strong sense in the culture that that's possible, that people can work on something that's very close to them, that they'll find allies, and that they'll get support. So I think that's an important element in keeping the culture going. The second thing that's, I think, very important for us is, I was talking to some folks at lunch. There was a time when the Chenards, who own all the stock, I think were ready to sell. And the advantage to them is they could have sold the company for X number of dollars, created an environmental foundation, and given away a lot more money every year than we do now as a company. But part of the reason they wanted to keep the company is because we can be an example. That if we function as a profit-making company and can be respected by other companies for the work we do as a business, and at the same time we choose to do certain things because we get interested in them first, or we're motivated to do them for reasons that have nothing to do with profit, but we can show that a business can do it, that's a tremendous advantage. And that's an advantage you don't get from just having a foundation. So that's really critical to our mission. So the first, the first part is build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, and the last is use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. And so that's why we're in business. And I think as long as we stay focused that way, we won't have any trouble attracting and retaining good folks, even though our volleyball courts are not as nice as yours.
Well, on that note, Vincent, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your question.